Well, good afternoon, DEC members and guests. I'm Steve Grigorian, President and CEO of the Detroit Economic Club, coming to you from lovely downtown Detroit. A couple of quick announcements before we get started. I always want to take a brief moment to thank the terrific DEC sponsors for their continued support of our mission, and you're seeing those on your screen. And I always want to thank you for continuing to support the DEC with your membership. On a program note, for the next few weeks, we've got a ton of virtual meetings, and they are everyone's favorite price, free. Next Thursday, you want to be with us on Zoom as we talk to John Della Volpe, author of Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. And then we'll see you on March 8th for our very popular monthly Money Talk series. This time we'll be joined by the head of Wells Fargo Investment Institute. Plenty on the calendar. Check them out. Get a registration. There's something for everyone, and we're always adding more. You already know how important it is to the DEC that we always include high school and college students in everything we do. Today, we want to say welcome to students from Schoolcraft College, and a first for the Detroit Economic Club, students and professors from the Masters of Professional Accountancy at the University of California, San Diego. We're very happy you have all joined us today. The club's got an incredible history of speakers, and today's speaker joins a distinguished list of 12 others who in our 88-year history have addressed the DEC on this day, February 16th. It's an eclectic list that begins with a speaker way back in 1942, and that was Major General Nesbitt, who was the UK's Director of Military Intelligence. That list also includes a couple of American economists, including Stuart Chase in 1948 and Dr. Arthur Laffer in 1988. And it also includes CEOs from Bethlehem Steel, Time Magazine, and Reader's Digest. And today, we're pleased to add Alec Ross as our 13th speaker on this day in DEC history. Alec is a New York Times bestselling author of The Raging 2020s, Companies, Countries, People, and the Fight for Our Future, which is, of course, the subject of today's meeting. His prior book, The Industries of the Future, has been a bestseller on 5 continents. He is currently a distinguished visiting professor at l'Università de Bologna Business School. Previously, Alec served as Distinguished Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins University and a Senior Fellow at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Alec has also served our country as Senior Advisor for Innovation to the Secretary of State. He started his career as a 6th grade teacher through Teach for America in inner city Baltimore. And I met Alec last September at the Mackinac Policy Conference. And after I heard his presentation, I immediately invited Alec to address the DEC, and he was kind enough to accept. So I'm glad we could make that happen. So we're pleased he carved out some time for us today from Baltimore. Let's say hello and welcome Alec Ross to the Detroit Economic Club.
Thank you for having me, Steve. It's a thrill to be with you and an honor just given the composition of this audience. And my wife is particularly pleased that I'm doing this. She is a native of Dexter, Michigan, and a graduate of the University of Michigan. So we enjoy our time in your neck of the woods, Steve.
Love having you here. You're welcome anytime. So your book, Alex, The Raging 2020s, Companies, Countries, People, and the Fight for Our Future is a terrific read. And from time to time, you're going to see the book link in the chat room, and I encourage you to click on it and purchase it. I do want to take a minute to give our viewers context. So your book explains today's car crash at the intersection of business, government, and everyday people. For 150 years, there has been this social contract between companies, governments, and people. But now the balance is shaken loose. And you write it's time for a new social contract. You do a really good job examining the economic and political forces that brought us to where we are today. And I think you do a great job looking at trends shaping our next few years, as well as offering suggestions. And you did a really good job of scaring the you-know-what out of me. So here we go. It's your book intro. You describe the quiet equilibrium of your day and, the equilibrium in today's relationship between business, government, and we the people. And you state today's social contract is broken. So take us through that to get us started, please.
Sure. Well, why don't I take you through that, sort of going through a typical day in my life?
Sure.
Let's pick a day from last week. The first thing I did that morning and every morning is make coffee. I roll out of bed, brew a pot, make breakfast for the kids. I was leaving on a business trip, so pack an overnight bag and book a ride share to the airport. My wife, that University of Michigan grad, Felicity, and I wrangle the kids into the car, and Felicity drives them off on the way to the elementary school where they go and where she teaches. As everyone starts their day, I'm passing through security. It's an uneventful morning, but when you peel back its layers and imagine the invention and ingenuity that power our daily lives, it can boggle the mind. In less than 3 hours, I go from sleeping in my bed to flying across the country. I'm just sitting there unfazed, scrolling through emails. We hardly know it, but our lives are built on a webwork of collaboration and exchange between individuals, government, and business. And when it all works in concert, we end up with a kind of quiet, everyday magic. Life made easier by 1,000 tricks just outside our vision. Like rewind to that coffee pot, for example, with that first cup of coffee, or even the water. The drinking water that pours out of my faucet and into my coffee pot is provided by a public water system built all the way back in the 1920s that ensures it's safe. The coffee I bought from Zeke's, my local roastery, cost me less than 30 cents a cup to make. The fact that I can have what was once a luxury at a favorable price every day is the result of centuries of agricultural progress topped by free trade agreements with the Central American countries that produce the beans. Or consider all the factors that go into this simple commute. When my wife steps out the door, she drives our kids to school in a Honda designed in Japan, manufactured in Alabama on roads built by government, using rules that have been refined over decades to keep everybody from driving into each other. And if they do get into an accident, we can trust in the government-mandated airbags that Honda installed. Meanwhile, as I use a rideshare app for the drive to the airport, the driver finds me and navigates us using government-created GPS. And at the airport, I'm as cool as the other side of the pillow because I know the TSA will ensure that no guns or knives are brought onto the plane because of barcode technology developed by the National Science Foundation and the CIA. Before we take off, I text Felicity using a mobile phone made by Apple over a network managed by AT&T over cellular frequencies managed by the FCC. What's going on with all of this is the invisible silent interplay between government, business, and citizens that continues to take place all day, every day. But in the last 20 years, that equilibrium's been thrown off. Look closer at that coffee pot. The same free trade agreements that benefit me, my local coffee roaster, and billions of workers in the developing world have provided shocks to the working class in developed economies. The water system built in the 1920s is crumbling. Somehow we were able to commit to huge public works programs 100 years ago, but we don't really build bridges, rail lines, or new utility systems anymore. And Felicity's car was built in Alabama as opposed to her native Michigan because of the state's tax giveaways and anti-union laws. The workers ended up losing while the benefits accrued only to shareholders. And my children's public schools are crowded and under-resourced. And so it's what's happened right now. What's happened right now is the silent equilibrium, the interplay between government rules, between the hopes and needs of citizens, and the private sector being able to act as the engine behind all of this. We've sort of lost our balance within that world.
All right, let's get into some of the chapters of the book. You start off with shareholder and stakeholder capitalism. So for Milton Friedman, a business's purpose is to maximize its profits for its shareholders. That's shareholder capitalism. However, as you point out, there are consequences. You detailed the modernization of the poultry industry as an example of big corporations squeezing out the little guy and what that's meant to rural America in the last 50 years. Now, I want you to shift to August 2019 and Amazon. They did something that swings their pendulum from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. Tell us about that.
Sure. So, let me back up a little bit and just say, the idea of shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism doesn't mean that, stakeholder capitalists don't care about making money. In fact, they do. What they do believe, though, is instead of shareholder primacy, shareholder capitalism, which only holds that the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth beneficiaries of a firm should be the shareholders. It recognizes a broader community, whether it's to try to pivot us from shareholder capitalism, which has created an almost Mad Max-like state of inequality, to more inclusive stakeholder capitalism. And in 2019, there were a couple developments. One of the most notable was the Business Roundtable, a group of 190 some of America's biggest companies, which were founded in essence to advocate for the interests of business in Washington. They pivoted and said, you know what, we're now changing our mission from being one that focuses solely on maximizing shareholder value to recognizing that we're all better off if we follow stakeholder capitalism. So I wouldn't say that stakeholder capitalism has triumphed yet, but we're beginning to recognize that our capitalism is in need of some repair.
Can you talk about the Amazon thing, 2019? Yeah.
So the example that I point to with Amazon more often than not, which I think sort of draws out some of the inanity in shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism, is, in the midst of, I don't know if this was in 2019, but the example that I think of when I think of stakeholder versus shareholder capitalism with Amazon, it was during the pandemic, and Amazon had decided to make a $6 billion investment in worker safety and well-being. And because they made that $6 billion investment, their share price fell by 74, their market capitalization fell $74 billion. So by spending $6 billion on their workers, it cost the value of the firm $74 billion. And it was sort of this wildly illustrative moment that showed that shareholder capitalism doesn't work especially well. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about it, of course, is that those people who saw, oh my gosh, you're spending $6 billion on your workers, we're gonna sell our stock in you. They ultimately were punished because the shares of Amazon rose then 30% over the next 6 months. But it does, I think, and I tell the story a little bit, and drew out some of the incongruity that exists within American capitalism right now.
Alec, there's no perfect formula for implementing stakeholder capitalism, but you believe there's some concrete steps that we can take to map out a company's footprint. Tell us about those.
Sure, I do think that I'm a capitalist. In addition to the work that I do, academically, the work that I've done in government, I'm a partner in a venture capital fund with $1 billion of assets under management. So, I'm not taking a kumbaya approach to capitalism, but I do believe that there are very concrete measures we can take that'll make our capitalism work better. And I think, for example, about our ESG goals, our goals, our sustainability goals. One of the things that all of us who live and work in the world of business is we're rooted in data and incentives. What is the math behind what we're doing? What are the inputs and the outputs? And what are the incentives that drive my behavior? Unfortunately, right now, anything that appears to be stakeholder capitalism oftentimes is rooted in PR. Not always, but often. And so one of the things that I do believe is that we need something like GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, a sort of a uniform measure that goes into establishing a firm's value, profitability, and productivity. There's an entire industry that exists to measure firm performance. I think we need something like GAAP around things like environment, sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. where the business sector, and I would really hope that the private sector would lead on this, coalesces around a uniform way of measuring and reporting performance in this area. So that's one concrete example that I'll point to.
Perfect. Folks, if you've heard something that Alec has said that's piqued your interest, we're going to get to audience questions at the end of this. So use the chat room, send it in to me, and we'll give it a look. So moving on through the book, another chapter about governments and corporations, and a provocative statement by you in this chapter. And here it is: rather than having a government of, by, and for the people, the US and other countries now have a government of, by, and for the businesses that purchase the governments they want. Tell us how that came to be and why you think that's the case today.
Yeah, I mean, it's fairly remarkable. I mean, right now, 95% of the elections in the United States are won by the candidate who spends the most money, who has the most money to spend. And we've become, and this is not the democracy that our founding fathers imagined. If you speak to a member of Congress, a member of the United States Senate, and ask them how many hours a week they spend fundraising, it's fairly remarkable. And so what's happened, and it's rooted in, for example, I'm sure 90% of you participating today are familiar with Citizens United, which basically said that money is speech. Therefore, you cannot regulate investments into political campaigns any more than you can regulate speech. It basically created an unbounded space for corporations, basically corporations and wealthy individuals, to engage in political processes using the force and effect of their capital in ways that were unimaginable even 20 years ago. And so what this has done is and I've worked in government. I've spent a lot of time in the White House, and this isn't to say that all government is corrupt, but on issues of access, on issues of power, particularly in the legislative branch, it's remarkable the degree to which how deterministic money is. And it's further exacerbated by the fact that if you look at how well paying it is to influence government, take money and elections out of it, the number one destination now for retiring members of Congress or the Senate is to become lobbyists. You can go from making $180,000 or whatever it is as a congressman to making $1,800,000 a year as a lobbyist. I mean, I know when I left government, I mean, the time I walked, the number of job offers I had that were anywhere between 5 and 15 times more what I was making in government is remarkable. And so, and I think that we need to recognize that there are 196 countries on planet Earth, and the United States is really unique in this respect. And so I think that the degree to which money drives process and outcomes in the US creates a series of fairly bizarre outcomes. So going back for a moment to shareholder versus stakeholder capitalism, going back to that airplane that I was flying on during that day at work, Boeing and the airline I were flying received massive government bailouts, despite the airlines having generated more than $49 billion in free cash flow during the previous decade. And the reason they weren't able to tap that $49 billion once trouble hit was not because they'd been investing in new planes, better service, or better salaries for their workers. No, they'd spent $47 billion of that $49 billion on stock buybacks. And Boeing spent $43 billion of its $58 billion in free cash flow on stock buybacks. Now, in Europe, when airlines like Lufthansa got bailouts amidst the COVID crisis, the government said, all right, well, if we're going to give you billions of dollars, then it becomes effectively the property of the citizens. We want 25% of the company in exchange for these billions of dollars of bailouts. In the United States, there were absolutely no strings attached to the bailouts that went into the companies that benefited from teachers, nurses, plumbers, and farmers, ensuring their liquidity. And why was this? It was because of the power of money in government. So the power of money in government ultimately plays an incredibly deterministic role, and a role that really is unique among the 196 countries on planet Earth.
Let's shift gears a bit. I want to talk about workers and labor. And you offer a startling fact about wages. At the end of the Cold War, workers earned 11 cents of every dollar they made for the company. 30 years later, they made just 6 cents on every dollar. And here in the US, we've experienced such a dramatic increase in the wealth gap between labor and capital. Why?
So the answer to the why to that is really rooted in our going from a dominantly industrial and manufacturing based economy into one that's technology rich and knowledge based. So for example, if you think about the development of the automotive industry, for example, the development of the automotive industry produced billions of dollars of profits. But as it produced billions of dollars of profits, it also produced millions of jobs. Now, what we see are exceedingly small workforces producing enormous profits. So the number of actual employees inside an Apple or a Google or a Facebook or a Netflix relative to an industrial or manufacturing firm of sort of similar economic power is fairly remarkable. And I think we do need to, like, I know sometimes people get bored with the math behind this thing, but I do think I do want to give some numbers. Over the last 30 years, just in the United States, the top 1% has grown 21 trillion with a T, $21 trillion richer. That's the top 1%, while the bottom 50% have grown $900 billion poorer, and the middle class has stagnated. So that's in the last 30 years. If we go back the last 40 years, if the level of inequality in the United States had just stayed the same, a constant level over the last 40 years, instead of widening to its current Mad Max-like state, it would mean that $50 trillion would have gone to workers earning below the 90th percentile. So we're talking about 90% of America. $50 trillion would have gone to workers earning below the 90th percentile. And that's an additional $1,100 per worker per month. So imagine workers with $1,100 per month coming in. And that's just if things had stayed the same. I'm not talking about 1 cent worth of sort of socialist redistribution. I'm just saying if the rate of inequality had remained the same over the last 40 years. And the second thing that I would point to is why we've gotten to this point, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more in a little while, is taxes. The wealthier you are, the lower a percentage of your income you pay in taxes, as a practical matter, for all intents and purposes. And that's because we tax capital in such a vastly different way than we tax labor. I mean, it shouldn't be the case that the worst thing you can do from a tax standpoint is work. And I've seen it. I'm just going to be terribly undiplomatic and uncensored. As I went from being a school teacher, being a not wealthy business person, working in government, to the world that I live in now, which is the world of capital, what I saw is the degree to which my income would shoot up and my effective tax rate would go down. And it's because of the wildly different way in which we tax capital versus labor, and because of the way in which we can globalize capital. I remember I was on a boat of one of the wealthiest people I know, a multi-billionaire, and we were on his fancy boat in the Caribbean. And I looked at the flag on his boat, and look, I'd worked at the State Department for years. I'm pretty good at recognizing flags, but I didn't recognize the flag that was on this boat. I'm like, what country is that? And he looked at me with sort of a shit-eating grin, and he told me the name of some teeny tiny little Caribbean country. And he goes, you know what? He goes, I've turned this $100 million yacht into something that is profitable because I'm able to incorporate it and run it offshore. And so the other thing that I would point to that's created this Mad Max-like state of inequality is rooted in our tax system, which punishes labor and rewards capital.
Perfect segue, because I want to dig a little bit deeper. That chapter about taxes really caught my attention. I know a Starbucks barista pays more taxes than Starbucks Corporation. FedEx driver pays more taxes than FedEx Corporation. And you say taxes are a skeleton key for unlocking the problems that emerge out of using a 20th century set of policies to solve 21st century problems. And in this chapter, Alec, you take us on a really deep dive into some, for me, mind-boggling acrobatics between Google subsidiaries in multiple countries to avoid taxes. Tell us about that.
Sure. So I do a little fictional case study about a guy named Marco buying a belt. And Marco's in Rome, and he buys a belt from an Italian belt maker in Florence after clicking on a Google ad. And I follow the taxes in the transaction. And what it comes out with, if you sort of look at the taxes of all of the stakeholders in there, Marco, who makes 75,000 euros a year, pays about 40% of his annual income in taxes. The belt maker pays about 38%. There's about a 20% VAT tax on the transaction for that belt. But if you actually look at the percentage of profit that Google paid on that transaction, it's about 0.7%, so less than 1%. And that's despite Italy having a corporate tax rate over 20%. And when I dug in to try to figure out why that was the case, it's a guy in Rome clicking on a Google ad in Italy and buying a belt from a belt maker in Florence. It's all Italy. What I learned is that the Google AdWord technology, in this case, is basically leased to an Italian subsidiary of Google from its Irish parent. Its Irish parent leases other intellectual property related to the transfer of data and the underlying technology. Basically, it's a shell game where Google is transferring, tens of billions of dollars of costs from one Google subsidiary to another Google subsidiary, and banking them all as costs. And when it finally reaches its endpoint, like, all right, who actually gets the cash? It is a Google holdings company in Bermuda, PO Box 666, Hamilton, Bermuda, where it has a 0% corporate tax rate. And what's mind-boggling about this is it's legal. There's absolutely nothing that Google has done that's illegal. These are not criminals. But in the same way in which globalization has enabled the movement of people around the world, as well as capital around the world, what it's also done is enable the movement of sort of tax homes around the world. And it's created this really dysfunctional, almost lattice work of corporate ownership of data, of information, of products and services, which enable the world's largest companies to pay effectively no taxes. So the examples that you gave, Steve, there are years where a single 17-year-old minimum wage making barista at Starbucks has paid more in federal taxes than Starbucks. And there have been multiple years out of the last 10 where a single FedEx driver has paid more in federal taxes than FedEx. And it's not because Starbucks wasn't profitable, and it's not because FedEx wasn't profitable. It's because of the way in which they are able to expense and domicile their activities around the world.
So it is so incredibly complex, that whole system. And we're starting to get a couple of questions in the chat about that. I'll paraphrase it. Can we even begin to get to reforms? It's so massive and so complex. And how would we do that?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. And I'll point to two very concrete things that can be done. One is a global minimum tax. And this is something that is underway. The process is underway right now in the OECD. More than 130 of the world's 196 countries have signed up for this. And the global minimum tax would establish a basement. It would basically say no more 0% tax havens. You have to have a minimum tax of at least 15% in corporate tax, which, oh, by the way, corporate taxes in the United States are substantially higher than that. So nobody should be like bedwetting about saying, oh, you're raising my taxes. No, we're only raising your taxes if you are, based in the Caymans or in Bermuda or in Luxembourg or something like that. So the first thing is a global minimum tax to end the sort of race to the bottom to zero. And then the second thing, and excuse the super wonky language, unitary taxation with formulary apportionment. And so let me explain what that means. Unitary taxation means no, there's one Google. Enough with the Google Netherlands, Google Bermuda, Google ABCDH. Right. They say, you know what, you can have 70,000 subsidiaries if you want, but we are going to treat you as a single entity. So you can't say, oh no, that's not Google Italy that should be taxed for that. That's Google Ireland. And Google Ireland says, yeah, but we just spent $30 billion leasing our IP from Google Netherlands. And Google Netherlands said, well, actually, we had to report this up to Google Bermuda. No, there's one Google. And the second thing is formulary apportionment. And what does that mean? What that means is that instead of booking revenues in the country where a company is headquartered, like the Grand Caymans, or where a subsidiary is headquartered, you actually book the revenues locally. It's like sales taxes. So, if you sell something in Germany, you have to pay the taxes in Germany, regardless of where the parent is headquartered. And it already works in the United States. So if you buy something in Michigan, it doesn't matter if you live in Maryland. If you buy it in Michigan, you got to pay that Maryland state tax. So there is a basis for this. So the two big solutions, I believe, are number one, a global minimum tax, and number two, unitary taxation with formulary apportionment.
We just have to talk about, for me, one of the most startling chapters, and that is the chapter on foreign policy. And we'll talk about artificial intelligence in China. I learned there's one camera for every two people in China. And what China does with that data and AI is stunning. And now in your book, we learned that China is packaging their surveillance state and selling it to other countries. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, what's remarkable is they aren't even really selling it. They're practically giving it away. So we have finally crossed the threshold where it's like we're in a Philip Dick novel when it comes to state-sponsored surveillance in China. There are more, as you said, there are more surveillance cameras in China than there are people in the United States now. And there are 324 million of us in the United States. What's interesting is the degree to which the Chinese state is able to ingest data and then use that as a way of understanding sentiment, controlling sentiment, interceding into crimes as they are being contemplated, chatted about on social media. It's like that movie Minority Report, where people were arrested for murder before they committed the crime. This is now actually taking place in China. And it's highly appealing. This system is very highly appealing throughout much of the world, including certain states in Southeast Asia and in Africa. And what the Chinese have done, the Chinese have packaged, they recently did it in Zimbabwe. They will come in and say, you, Zimbabwe, you want a 5G mobile network. You want to have a technology-rich, knowledge-based economy, but you can't afford it. You can't afford these, you can't afford the multi-billion-dollar capex that goes into building these beautiful networks. What if we do it for you? What if we do it? And, we will cut you a better deal than any telecom anywhere else in the world would. And the flip side of this, though, is they have access to the data. And why would the Chinese want access to data in a country like Zimbabwe, for example? Well, they want it for a couple different reasons. One, they wanted to continually improve their facial recognition technology. And two, they wanted to be able to gain access to content on things like access to raw materials. So in the same way in which after the World War II, my uncle and a number of others established the Central Intelligence Agency as a way of trying to compete with the Soviets in the conflict with communism. We created the CIA as an outgrowth of the military OSS as a way of giving us an intelligence advantage. The Chinese are now basically creating their own technology-enabled apparatus for this. And the United States has that to a degree as well. But the scale and the use of that is far different in China than it is in, say, the United States with the NSA.
So countries have shifted their social contracts really in one of two directions. Either they've closed off and adopted this controlled authoritarian model like we just discussed, or they've opened up by welcoming innovation, investment, immigration, free speech. Where's this all headed, Alec?
Yeah, I think that the principal political and economic binary of the 20th century was right versus left, the political right versus the political left. I think the dominant political and economic and political binary of the 2020s and what will be into the 2030s is open versus closed. And what I mean by that, when I say open, I mean that broadly. I don't mean open borders so much as I mean upward economic and social mobility is not constrained to elites. It's rights respecting. It allows for the free flow of capital, ideas, and increasingly of people. Closed models, religious and cultural norms are set by central authorities. Access to markets is dictated by centralized government strategies. And so what we see right now is a real tension for me, less between the political left and the political right than between open systems and closed systems. If you think, for example, even right now about Russia, if you said, is Putin left or is he right? I wouldn't know how to answer that. He's a former communist, that he's supposed to be far left, but what is he doing that's left or right? It's more closed, it's authoritarian. So I do think that, and of the 196 countries on planet Earth, I've traveled to more than 100 of them. And the tension that I hear from leaders in governments around the world is this tension between open and closed more than right versus left.
Folks, once again, the book is The Raging 2020s. You can read more of Alex's thought leadership. The link is in the chat box. So, Alec, bring it all home for us. You really do paint, for me, a troubling picture of the 2030s if nothing changes during our current decade. And this might be by your design. If we act now, you say, positive things could happen. So tell us what those actions would look like.
Sure. I mean, I should say at the outset, I'm actually optimistic. I'm net optimistic about the world, in part because I think that only optimists change the world. What are some concrete things that we can do? Well, the first thing we do have to commit to doing is we have to commit to moving from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And this isn't without precedent. Stakeholder capitalism was the dominant model of American capitalism from World War II into the 1970s. Our capitalism foundered a bit in the 1970s, which led to the shift into shareholder capitalism. But I do believe that pivot is imperative. The second thing that I will point to is a more environmentally sustainable future. So I do believe, and this is an area where, particularly in Michigan, there are the aptitudes to imagine and invent the future. I do think that if the world's last $1 trillion industry was created out of computer code, the world's next $1 trillion industry is going to be figuring out how we can have a clean energy future. And so I do think that if we commit ourselves to the research, development, and commercialization of a clean energy future, not only will it make our world safer, it will also produce trillions of dollars of economic benefit and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of jobs. So that's the second thing that I would point to that we really need to commit ourselves to. And then the third thing that I would say that we need to commit to is tackling some of these tough issues on taxation. Taxation is difficult to solve for, in part because of its complexity. But if we do solve for issues related to the inherent inefficiencies in our tax system, it will mean that every middle-class taxpayer can pay less. So there are three concrete.
You froze a minute there, but I hope you're going to come back and see us. So if you're still with us, we've got just a couple minutes left, and I've got want to turn our attention. We've got some interesting questions that came in the chat room. One of them, Cameron asks, your response to the assertion that taxing capital stifles growth and innovation. How do you react?
Yeah, I don't think it stifles innovation. I think it stifles innovation. I think it stifles inclusive growth. And in fact, the degree to which capital markets have enabled innovation in the United States is one of its great strengths. The question is, how and when do you tax capital? So one of the things that I would say we need to preserve, for example, is our ability to create incentives for high-risk early-stage capital. So at the end of the day, if you want innovation, then you won't tax capital at all. But what you will have are lots of billionaires and millionaires and a lot of very poor people.
Let's see, Cyrus is asking about, from a capitalist standpoint, you think Africa will be a new frontier in business?
It's proving to be. The question is, what kind of capitalism will take place there? It's fascinating. One of my most successful investments as a venture capitalist is in a company called Andela, which we just financed. When we started investing, it was worth $30 million, and it just financed recently with a $1.5 billion post money valuation. And that company, for example, was rooted in the idea that talent is universally distributed, but opportunity is not. And we've trained tens of thousands of very talented young Africans to have great technology skills. And we're then basically selling those technology skills into the Fortune 500 to be able to work remotely for them. So it's extremely dynamic, and it is capitalist. I also think it's capitalist in part because the state governments are too weak to be able to enact anything socialist. So if you think about socialism by its nature is controlled by the state, I think the state is too weak in most of these African countries to be able to enable that. The question is it a more authoritarian capitalism, or is it a more broadly inclusive capitalism with transparent rule of law? It's a continent with 54 countries. There are some positive examples and there's some negative examples right now of how capitalism is developing there.
I've got an interesting question. It's probably, I don't know if we've got time for a full answer, but this is from one of the leadership out at University of California, San Diego. How do you identify, engage with, determine the value, and ultimately compensate stakeholders? Shareholders are last in line for return on investment. That's because of their risk taken. How much do you compensate other stakeholders, and how do I rationalize? What if they disagree with the exchange value? That's a mouthful.
Yeah, so I disagree with the premise of the question. Shareholders are not last in line for return on capital. They tend to be the first in line for return on capital. And I say this as a venture capitalist. When sure, you have to employ the employees that benefit from, as a firm is formed and as it is operating. But I fundamentally disagree with the premise of the question. I don't think that they are last in line. I think that they're first in line. And to the question of how do you measure, how do you establish a set of metrics around stakeholders? This goes back to what I was describing previously when I was saying we need a gap, generally accepted accounting principles, that we have within shareholder capitalism to basically, you know, to have balance sheets for financial performance, I do think that we need to have a set of metrics that disciplines the idea of stakeholder capitalism. Now, having said that, it's not like this is a hypothetical based on a theoretical based on a maybe. If you look at Central and Northern Europe, for example, they are aggressive practitioners of stakeholder capitalism. And it's because basically of rulemaking made between the public and private sector that sort of sets out what the relationship between capital and labor will be. And in the case of Central and Northern European firms, shareholders are not necessarily first in line. They might be second or third in line. But that's because of essentially rules, laws, agreements that have been made that keep the relationship between state and capital, between labor and capital, a little bit more equal.
Well, I know they put, in Europe, they put some companies, public companies, put the workers on the board as well. So 30 seconds and we'll let you go. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope is the state of American entrepreneurship. So, you know, as much as I think our capitalism is damaged, I still think that America is far and away the greatest place to start a company, run a company, and create value. The audacity of our young entrepreneurs, their willingness to, more so now than ever, to identify and try to solve really big societal problems, they give me hope. Whether it's the 22-year-old or the 62-year-old, American entrepreneurship is really what gives me a lot of hope right now.
I love it. Folks, the book's The Raging 2020s. It is a great read. You're going to hear, like I said, more from Alec on his thought leadership in this book. So you can buy it just by clicking on the link in the chat. So Alec, a huge, huge thank you for spending time with the DEC. Good luck with the book. We wish you the best. Let us know how we can be helpful here in Detroit. And we hope the next time we host you, it'll be in person.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you all for participating.
Talk to you soon, Alec. Thank you.